Oh, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the AGM. Thank you very much indeed for coming. We're delighted today to have Professor Catherine Morgan speak to us. She is a Cambridge graduate who then worked at Royal Holloway in London and at King's College London, and was a very successful and long-serving director of the British School in Athens. She's now a senior research fellow at All Souls. And we're delighted to hear her speak on writing histories in the Ionian archipelago. Catherine, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you everyone for coming. If you can't hear me at the back, wave, semaphore, if my voice drops. I'm sure you will. Thank you very much. Well, my subject today is an archipelago that has captured Western imagination for centuries. The Ionian Islands, in an arc from Corfu to Zakynthos. Of course, from the perspective of classicists, Homer is the lure, beginning with the late 18th and early 19th century classicist topographers like William Gell, and I can't resist the chance to show you one of the treasures of the BSA archive, Gell's notebook of this trip. From that time on, the quest to map the Odyssey in the physical landscape of Ithaca or its neighbours spawned endless scholarly debate and established a distinctive dialogue with island communities, an enduring narrative of cultural identity. Archaeology became deeply implicated, largely due to a series of major international campaigns in the early 20th century, beginning with Wilhelm Dörpfeld's search for Homer's Ithaca on Lefkas, and in direct response, James Reynolds-Rod's sponsorship of a similar project by the British School at Athens on Ithaca. Many of their findings remain central to the literature, like the Bronze Age tumuli at Nidri on Lefkas, or the Poulos cave on Ithaca, with its geometric tripods and Hellenistic dedication to Odysseus. These campaigns fed local aspirations for identity, creating what are still living traditions, passionately felt. But they should also be understood in the wider context of Western neo-imperialist appropriation of Greek nostoi. The search for Odysseus' Ithaca ran parallel to the Italian quest for Aeneas at Butrint and across the Adriatic. And I do use the term neo-imperialist advisedly. Reynolds-Rod had been British ambassador in Rome until 1919. He retained a very strong interest in Italian cultural politics, and he admired Mussolini's interventions. His correspondence with Dörpfeld through the 1930s, which is now in the Bodleian, reveals an increasingly shared outlook. Oops, let's get this the right way. Although Odysseus' palace remains a phantom, a wealth of information of all periods flowed from these campaigns. The Homeric frame quickly proved constraining in terms of period and geography. Yet before we dismiss it, it's worth recalling that the picture of the region fostered by the scholarly literature as peripheral, poor, ripe for rediscovery, bore no resemblance to contemporary reality. From 1800 to 1864, the islands were a federal state. From 1815 onwards, a British protectorate, part of the empire in the Mediterranean. Prosperous, mercantile, with thriving education and arts, they were also a hotbed of political radicalism. Their wealth, worldwide connections, and socio-economic interdependence continued after unification with Greece. Now, the director of the Reynolds-Rod expedition, Walter Hertley, moved from work in the true poverty of post-World War I Macedonia to an Ithaca where household wealth was measured in pianos. This is his previous excavation at Chowchitsa by the Bulgarian border, right on the 1918 front line. In fact, it was a site discovered by the Friends Ambulance Brigade, who had a clearing station right at the base of the front line. And Hertley describes the top layers littered with shrapnel as he was going through. The difference could not be more marked, yet it's concealed by a mutual denial of modernity. In the islands, the archaeological literature paints a romantic picture of a pre-modern world, one now embraced by the tourist industry. The reality should be a spur to reset our expectations of the complexity possible here. Now, shaping a new agenda for the archipelago is the focus of my current research. And today I want to try and persuade you that in an environment like this, tackling really basic questions, the political and social shaping of communities within shifting regional contexts, the relationship between economic activity, state politics, and institutions, and the social construction of land and seascapes brings together current hot topics in a fruitful, if rather challenging way. These topics include the nature of ancient federalism, classical economies and longue durée shifts in scale and complexity, the specific role of material culture in expressing identity, and especially discussion following from Horden and Purcell's Corrupting Sea around issues of analytical scale, networks, local impacts, responses, and agency. I'll focus on the period from 800 to 300 BC precisely because it is so difficult to treat from textual sources, and so it can slip from view. Epigraphic evidence for political institutions is largely Hellenistic. Very little survives of Aristotle's constitutions, of the Ithacesians, Lefkadans, Ambraciots, Aetolians, Acarnanians, Epirets. There are actually a lot of them in the northwest. And the scale and scope of change in the 3rd and 2nd centuries makes retrojection risky. From Thucydides onwards, historians offer some contemporary insights into the archipelago and neighbouring regions, and the temptation to treat these as hooks for narratives about regional development is often irresistible. How many accounts of pre-federal Aetolia prefer Thucydides' backwoodsman to our understanding from archaeology? It's much nicer to have people who basically eat babies than paint nice architectural terracottas. Setting aside the fact that most accounts are externally motivated, explanations are reliant on historical contingency, let alone the minutiae of alliances and campaigns, are missed opportunities. So I'll begin with a brief introduction to the archipelago to demonstrate the great differences in size and affordance of the islands, and then outline some trends in scholarship on islands and on federalism, before presenting themes and case studies from different material perspectives, to give a flavour of the region and I hope a little something of interest to everyone. Now, the central part of the archipelago is our focus today. Mostly for reasons of time, I apologise in advance to those interested in Corfu. This central part has distinct inner and outer zones. The inner islands and get used to this. The inner islands and Lefkas belong with the Acarnanian coast, the Playa Peninsula, which is basically the Piraeus of Lefkas, and the 3 main bays, almost much larger in antiquity, which housed polis at least by late archaic times. When Corinth colonised Lefkas around 625 BC, the straits were dredged for navigation and one of the major harbours in the northwest established. The older port to the south in Veliko Bay, modern Nidri, remained important, not least as an alternative when the channel silted up. It links with the inner archipelago, the Taphian Islands in the northwest, of which only Meganisi was permanently settled, and the smaller Echinades in the south, which screen the entrance to Astrakos harbour and the Achelous Delta. These are the remains of much larger formations submerged through the Holocene. They're karstic with numerous caves and natural water sources, often near the coast, so good for grazing and for supplying ships, very limited for cultivation. The outer islands are much larger. Lefkas is largely mountainous and wooded. Its 3 main areas of lowland plain were all settled and politically united in a single polis with its asti just south of modern Lefkas. The south and east coast are hospitable with many small bays by accessible pockets of farmland, but the west is steep and treacherous. Cape Ducato, Sappho's Leap, is at its southern tip. It's a notorious landmark beloved of 19th century romantic painters. Next is Ithaca, a figure of 8 articulated around a small isthmus, and the asti of the island's single polis at modern Aiatos. The north has smaller but more visually connected pockets of cultivable land, mostly within reach of the sea, while the south has a confined plain behind the enclosed bay of Vathi. The narrow channel which separates Ithaca from Kefalonia is a vital artery, almost entirely surveyed from the isthmus. And in fact, from the Aiatos Acropolis, you get this marvellous 360-degree view right round the islands. It's wonderful. Kefalonia is the largest of the islands, with 4 polis. Thucydides calls them a tetrapolis, but at least in our period, cities pursued independent interests, sometimes in conflict, and benefited from different combinations of resources and external orientations. Sami has the largest agricultural territory and is most closely aligned with Ithaca and the northwest. On the opposite side of the island, Pali, an important station on a different route west, took an independent line, allied with Corinth for much longer than the rest of the island. In the south, Proni and Krani may be geographically oriented towards Zakynthos, the western Peloponnese and the Corinthian Gulf. But their harbours, and especially control of the resources of Mount Ennos, including the famous tall fir trees used for shipbuilding, attracted different alliances. Proni, in particular, was likely a target for Athenian attempts to secure resources for the trireme fleet from the mid-5th century onwards. Finally, we come to Zakynthos, which differs again in being over half agricultural plain, with much lower central mountains and accessible uplands. The major settlements, the Asti on the east coast, and important secondary sites on either side of the Gulf of Laganas in the south, including the bitumen wells at Keri, again important for naval supply, are oriented east towards Elis and Trophilia. And one look at this and you understand why Thucydides underlines the Athenian desire to detach this island from the Peloponnese, to grab the resources, forbid access to the harbours. This brief sketch shows distinct but interlocking qualities and scales of connection, shared characteristics of geography and material culture, making a plausible region, relations between independent polis, a pull towards the nearest part of the mainland, but also micro-environments created via specific cross-island links. Maritime space is integral to this. Attention has tended to focus on the long-distance sea routes, which run through the archipelago north into the Adriatic, west to Sicily and the Bay of Naples, or via Corcyra across to Otranto and Sybaris. A distinctive feature of these routes is their seamless connection into the major navigable river systems, the Arachthus via the Gulf of Ambracia, or the Achelous to the south, making this a region of very complicated maritime penetration. So it's inevitable that the history of any part of the archipelago, let alone its entirety, is entwined with ever larger narratives, and ultimately the emergence of the Adriatic as a connected maritime space. To put this into perspective, the trading post at Spina dates from around 600 BC, with a mid-Adriatic shrine on Palagruja and plentiful Greek imports in the Dalmatian islands under a century later. So very quickly people are moving right to the head of the Adriatic. Intertwined with all this is more local transport of goods in, out and around the archipelago, and the regular human mobility which sustained island life and influenced settlement location and taskscapes. Seas around the outer islands are comparatively wide and deep, but often blighted by treacherous crosswinds or sudden calm, the Ithaca Channel especially, where we find the majority of our shipwrecks. While the inner archipelago, which you see here, has small land masses separated by narrow channels with restricted visibility, yet greater shelter and easier passage for good navigators. Now, these circumstances speak to two particular areas of current research. First, islands, archipelagos, and maritime connectivity. In a recent article, Cyprian Broodback asked, provocatively enough, whether island archaeology actually matters anymore. Reviewing decades of scholarship, he concluded that island stories have come to emphasize, and I quote, different qualities of human social, political, and economic association than those of more standard continental narratives, with less emphasis on vertical structures and territorial integrity, and more on flat hierarchies, horizontal networks, and self-ordering, fluid, open systems. Well, we might dispute the last point, given the long history of research, especially in the Aegean, going back to Patrice Brun's 1996 studies of archipelagos, which examined Aegean political history in terms of hierarchies, of power, interdependence, and resource distribution. And then, of course, Christy Konstantakopoulos' 2007 Dance of the Islands, which problematized the very idea of insularity, addressing patterns of formal subjugation, control, and informal interdependence. By contrast, the network turn around this time tended, at least for our period, to approach connectivity in a slightly descriptive fashion. With honourable and some rather important exceptions, predictive analyses came from prehistory and the Roman period. Yet insights from other periods are invaluable in the complex and varied Ionian archipelago. I think, for example, of Tom Tartaran's work on Bronze Age harbour networks, which reopen the question of the kind of infrastructure we should be looking for in the material record to understand mobility in this kind of environment. The most recent turn to the maritime seeks to reintegrate territorial and maritime space within a continuum of lived experience, while recognising their very different qualities of security or danger, unification or separation, community life or sequestration on board. Again, this holds great promise for the Ionian, where diverse land, river and seascapes were so closely connected. Broadbank's observation about the differentiation of land and continental histories hits home, however. We simply cannot make this distinction in a region like ours, where Lefkas, the inner islands and coastal Acarnania were part of the same environment, closely linked to the interior. This, in fact, is a view from Poulos, from the lower slopes of one of the main cities, straight across to Kastos. It's just across the pond. And a region also where political borders ebbed and flowed across a zone of increasingly intense economic connection. The Copenhagen Inventory treated the islands as an offshore extension of mainland states. But it seems more pertinent to consider the extent to which islands and islanders were able to just transform the wider dynamics around their perimeters. How disruptive were they? Where did agency lie? What did it matter to have a small clutch of independent and slightly cantankerous city-states across the water from your emerging federation? What could possibly go wrong? So this leads us to the second area of research, the nature and development of federal states. We've progressed swiftly from the Copenhagen Polis Centre's recognition of polis dependency and the early existence of different forms of association through my own work on how different aspects of community life played out within and beyond polis borders, contributing to the maintenance of tiered identities and the utility of the ethnic register. Hans Beck and Peter Funke's comparative study of Greek federations then took a kind of bottom-up approach to federalism, emphasising commonality, convergence as the roots of federal states, but allowing pragmatic accommodations, flexibility, and a role for the purely parochial. By contrast, Emily Mackel's great work on federal states focused on institutions. Those, she argued, define the state, emphasising the role of a kinon in protecting and managing fragile and highly interdependent regional economies. The state is there to regulate the economy. Mackel's top-down view of markets and economies drew largely on epigraphic sources, incidentally exposing the conceptual and methodological challenges involved in incorporating material evidence into studies of this kind. But incorporate it we really must, if we're to write the kind of longue durée narratives necessary to understand the emergence, embedding and success, or not, of federal institutions and the extent of path dependency. We may have an inscription describing an institution at Delphi, but do we actually know that it worked? I think it's also important, if we're not to relegate regions like the Ionian archipelago, where rich stories cannot be told from text alone. So these seem to me the current challenges which we can address. And against this background, I turn to three stories. Sorry, this is utterly counterintuitive, so I apologise if I... going forward to going back. I turn to three stories about economy, mobility, and identity in the islands. Now, in recent years, study of the classical Greek economy has overturned Moses Finley's static, non-market model to embrace dynamism, growth, and diverse forms of exchange, including markets on different scales for different commodities and labour. The challenge now is to track the long-term economic history of a region, to model shifts in scale, changing actors and interests, winners and losers. My case study here is Lefkas founded with Ambracia and Anactorium by Corinthians a century after Corcyra, itself the northwards expansion of an established Corinthian network on the islands and Apulia. So basically we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, the consolidation point, which I suggest is because of a fairly rapid breakdown in relations between Corcyra and Corinth really made it necessary to intervene to secure access to a port, the Ambracian Gulf, and inland routes north. Pre-Hellenistic Anactorian is little known, but Lefkas and Ambracia developed in parallel. Ambracia as a centre of trade and manufacture, of metalwork with an eye to Dodona, coroplastics which flooded northwestern and island sanctuaries, and ceramics, including the red figure popular with far-flung Epirot communities, perfume amphorae and containers with a wide western distribution. What we might term semi-luxury products feature very prominently in the economy of this city. An extensive hora gave food security in often hostile country. This 6th century memorial here to the murdered escorts of Corinthian ambassadors recalls the dangers in the region. Lefkas was first and foremost a port handling both transit trade and import and transshipment, especially of agricultural produce, grain, wine, oils, perfume ingredients, probably a range of local commodities from fish to salt, waxes and resins. The city's success rested on the opening of the 6-kilometre long canal. The surviving, probably mid-5th century, southern harbour mole is one of the great feats of Greek maritime engineering, with a larger footprint than Polycrates' mole on Samos in the Pythagorean harbour, albeit in rather shallower water. By this time, there's evidence of amphora production, extensive warehousing, and at least one set of ship sheds. Now, we can use various measures of economic growth to describe the city. 3 ships sent to Salamis, 800 hoplites to Plataea, together with Anactorian. The expansion of the urban grid, and in the few house blocks analysed in detail, a steady and consistent increase in house size, internal complexity, wealth of decoration. From the 4th century, there's sufficient evidence to assess coin circulation, both the composition of local hoards and the distribution of Lefkathan coinage, which shows a very, very strong link across to Sicily, and to trace epigraphically the presence of foreign residents, the origins of the circles of negotiatores and agents, which developed in the city through the 3rd century. In areas further from the town, tower residences supported cultivation and storage from the late 5th century on. Most of these are either round Nidri or in areas that are passage points from the plains down to the coast, perhaps to facilitate the shipping of produce up to Lefkas. The crucial question is whether the port sustained a regional economy beyond the island. Survey on neighbouring Meganisi and on Ithaca has revealed substantial late classical expansion, not only at major settlements, but also in the countryside. Now, the political status of Meganisi is unknown. If, as is probably the case, it was dependent on Lefkas, one might expect surplus to be sent there. And survey revealed at least one coastal shipping point up here at Juglio, where we have a large-scale supply amphora storage point. Ithaca is another matter. From the 4th century, we find similar towers and settlement growth, especially around Stavros in the north, with agricultural structures in the Poulos Valley below, and again another of these shipping points for bulk storage and movement of provisions. The connection between farming, storage and access to the sea is key. Given Ithaca's small size and limited resources, growth on this scale required human mobility and additional markets, adding capacity to connect and to amass capital. Some aspects of transport and shipping could be planned around predictable events: harvests, crop processing, annual assessments of grain security. But to make things actually happen, to cultivate and protect crops, make and move containers, house and feed workers, supply material rewards, required a shifting cast of residents, slaves, and free migrants. This may be one factor behind the Ithacesians' decision to issue their own bronze coinage early in the 4th century. These, the famous ones with Odysseus's capped head on them. While mobility can be hard to trace in the local record, analogous evidence is found in inquiries made of the oracle at Dodona by those looking to undertake contracts or to farm abroad. Should I stay or should I go is one of the classic forms of question at this oracle. And Pharos up in the Dalmatian islands seems to have been quite a favoured location. On Ithaca, the rewards are evident, for example, in the sudden appearance of plate in classical and Hellenistic graves. Now, it's possible that connections extended across the Ithaca Channel, since of all the Kefalonian polis, Sami combined the richest agricultural base, the largest quota, secured by fortified enclosures, and numerous classical to Hellenistic farmsteads, with heavy investment in a port which grew very quickly from a seaside archaic town. The double Acropolis was fortified and a large breakwater built in the 5th century, with a large grin-clad extension to the residential area in the 4th, or that red addition to the town plan. Here too, rising personal wealth is visible in the city's cemeteries. Sami's economic base was much more secure than that of Ithaca, yet it's hard to separate its growth from that further north, especially as it's distinctive on Kefalonia. The local importance of sea lanes around Ithaca and southern Lefkas is clear in the preferential development of ports at Sami, Aitos and Nidri. A regional system needs a distribution network, with alternatives for when the Lefkas channel was closed. So in short, we see increasingly close commercial networks cutting across polis boundaries, although as yet no evidence for the polis-level responses in fiscal policy or in the treatment of free migrants. That's where you need your epigraphy, and that's what we don't yet have. I add 2 further observations here. The first concerning transport. Different stages in the life cycle of an amphora, from manufacture to delivery to the bottler or shipper, cargo assembly, shipping, marketing, reuse or recycling, variously rely on the affordance of the vessel itself or on information added via stamps or written or verbal agreements. The Corinthian B and then more Adriatic type amphorae, which dominated northwestern markets, were made in several centres, including Corcyra and possibly Lefkas, some of which added stamps or other visual clues to origin. But the vast majority of these amphorae were anonymous, as were the broadly similar Greco-Italian shapes, which appear on the other side of the Adriatic, and slowly supersede them. Now, uniformity over this vast area aids the supply of vessels, the assembly of cargoes, the assessment of volume. But it leaves open really important questions: the contents, their provenance, their quality. That relies on contract or relations of trust. Transport within the archipelago at purely local level tended to use local jar forms with very limited circulation. We've got a nice group made on Sami from the 6th century onwards, for example. Outside the main ports, transport amphorae are surprisingly few and unevenly distributed. This may imply that transactions between trusted agents were focused in a very few, very specific locations. And this is hardly a surprise. But I think systems like this, which are so heavily dependent on trust, do help to explain why in the Adriatic, the increased scale and complexity of Hellenistic trade opened the way for a greater variety of visibly local amphorae. There's only so far you can go with a trust system. Well, in the Aegean, the opposite happened. Visible variety yields the way to simplicity and to economy of scale. My second point concerns the Acarnanian coast. The importance of Lefkas's Piraea is underlined by the construction, probably early in the Hellenistic period, of a monumental bridge linking it to the city. But the cities to the south were also drawn into this ambit, with a similar pattern of growth, major expansion in the 4th century, including large-scale land reclamation in the case of the polis of Astrakos. They're part of the maritime world, as well as entry points to the interior. And this, I think, is why it's simplistic to characterize them in really basic terms, either as Corinthian foundations by virtue of their location. There is absolutely no ancient evidence, material or textual, for these being colonies, but the idea refuses to die, or as part of whatever Acarnanian confederacy then existed. Before the confederacy took a dramatic coastal turn in the 3rd century with the incorporation of Lefkas, real political power lay in the interior, and the coastal towns were tangential. Military campaigns in the region during the Peloponnesian War made pragmatic choices about alliances unavoidable. But these should not thin our understanding of the complex identity of cities on the intersection. Only Alesia preserves a founder tradition. According to the poet of the Alcmeonis, as reported by Strabo, the hero Alesius was the son of Penelope's father and the brother of Leucadius. A multi-directional story typical of cyclical and later epic, which leads out into the islands, back into Acarnania, where the poet tells us that the 3 men reigned. This is how you place your community. Now, we've looked at just one of the economic networks within the archipelago. Others are available. They all cross island and polis borders. Sources for the main changes in scale and integration, which followed from the 3rd century, are much more plentiful, but they need historical context. The classical picture gives this and encourages consideration of long-term risk and opportunity. At island level, we can assess the effects of scale and affordance. A medium-sized island like Ithaca could gain resources and capital from external markets, but at the cost of dependence on external decision-making. Well, the local resources of a large island like Kefalonia gave greater economic security, but were liable to attract external intervention. At the benign end of this is the massive grid-planned city of Neoclani, founded about 300 BC. This is the work of actually one of my doctoral students who's working on RAF, historical aerial imagery over here, who pretty much indicated that the site is about double the size that we thought it was. It is a huge intervention. Almost certainly a Macedonian project to exploit the neighbouring bay as a naval harbour. It's abandoned simply when events move on. Within island communities, classical developments can help to explain otherwise unique settlement trajectories. Thus, for example, the tower at Ias Athanasius in northern Ithaca, which had direct access to particularly important sea lanes, became the centre of a rich Hellenistic village, rather than following the more usual course in the northwest of tower to farmstead and then perhaps to villa. This leads to our next theme: how communities cohered and expressed their identity in a world of high mobility and fragmented resources. Sanctuaries are the obvious starting point, but until recently we had little archaic and classical evidence. Ithaca apart, this largely consists of architectural spolia coming from those areas closest to the Peloponnese. Lack of exploration is one factor. Many shrines are known only from later literary sources, and the gaps in the map are pretty obvious. Post-antique construction and recycling, another. Cut stone is valuable. There may also have been an initial preference for more diverse ritual environments, with new late classical and Hellenistic sites like this, favouring architectural forms which spoke to Greek and non-Greek audiences around an increasingly connected Adriatic. The major importance of rural locations is confirmed thanks to a project run by the effort of paleoanthropology and speleology to document cave use, which has so far identified, in the islands here, 16 caves containing debris of ritual practice in and around the islands. Since these include old and or test excavations and surface collections, we've much still to learn. But we can identify distinct, non-exclusive roles for these shrines in the social landscape of the archipelago. For travellers, they could mark terrestrial or maritime passages or landing points, as Aia Kyriaki at the entrance to the harbour of Nidri. Ias Nicholas near Astikos exemplifies marker sites on high cliffs, which also offered shelter and water. Here, the double entrance to the cave is actually visible from the sea. It really doesn't help that there's a modern road dynamited into the cliff. It kind of destroys the atmosphere. But as you come right in, it's just in front of you. There's also a close link with the city of Astakos here, and most of the pottery is local, but the figurines include imports from Egypt to southern Italy. Alternatively, shrines could mark key locations in polis or local community territory, and or support ritual gatherings perhaps controlled by single communities, but open to wider participation. A feature of these sites is evidence for the preparation and consumption of food and drink on a large scale in organised communal events, challenging a common view that caves were sites of private worship, not public events. Indeed, one large cave, which you see here, Drakena and Kefalonia, high in the Vakina Gorge, on the main route linking Proni's main port at modern Poulos, with the interior uplands and the city Acropolis, contained all that one might expect of a polis sanctuary: altar, bones and ash from sacrifice and cooking, vessels for preparing and consuming the ritual meal, and votives. Yet the environments of these sites and the role of the caves within them exhibits too much variety to permit generalisation. The Eferet database contains large caverns, smaller cave pits, horizontal caves, rock shelters, their surroundings, steep slopes or flat land for assemblies, availability of water or ease of access by land, river or sea vary greatly. A cave might house ritual activity or give shelter, water or space for storage or the deposition of debris, and it could offer a different sensory experience. But when examining feasting at a communal level, the cave is just part of the context. We need to track back from the final stage of deposition to place our activities in the landscape. Two case studies illustrate different contexts in which ritual consumption served to cement group bonds. The first is a rural cave shrine in Bogliazzo. Here we go again, sorry. At Bogliazzo in northern Lefkas, used from the mid-8th century BC to the early 1st century AD. It overlooks a river valley leading from the highlands here around modern Kavalas towards Apolpina on the outskirts of the modern city. It's west of the North Cemetery of Lefkas and out of visual contact with the Acropolis. The cave is easy to reach, but is far too small to contain a gathering. And it has no structures, no walls, benches or altar, inside or out. Events must have been held outside, probably on this balcony-like plateau and in the gentle slopes that run round the back of the cave, with feasting debris and votives, figurines, unguent containers, miniatures, then deposited in the cave. Vessels for preparing and serving food and drink account for 85% of the record, with votives and sacrificial bones confirming the ritual context. This raises numerous questions on which we're still working. Who participated? City dwellers expressing interest in the countryside? Residents coming down from the highlands and or surrounding areas? What did they eat? We're still working on the results of our residue analysis. Was the feast a regular occasion or down to the wishes of a host? How were logistical issues solved? Now, rural gatherings tend to disappear from our archaeological radar after the early Iron Age, and literary evidence is also very slight. Menander's Discourse is a rare source to address the practicalities of feasting in a remote location. The plot entails a sacrifice, occasioned by a dream, which was the pretext for a lavish feast in the sanctuary of Pan at Philly, hosted by the wealthy mother of the protagonist. This feast evolved to meet shifting social requirements, the guest list growing alarmingly rapidly as events unfurled. The household slave hired the mahiras, transported pots, pans, rugs, cushions, mattresses from house to shrine, and created a lavish setting in a simple, natural location, fixing tables and couches, fetching water, mixing wine. The mahiras, Sikon, supplied, sacrificed, and butchered a sheep, and as a resourceful cook, coped with all practical difficulties thrown at him from the first moment when he discovers he's forgotten the large stew pot. The feast in the Discourse is, of course, a comic creation, not a blueprint. but it speaks of practicalities which must have resonated with the play's audience. And to the labour and spectacle of consuming and preparing food, we can add other aspects of sensory experience. The use of light, perfumes and unguents was all attested at Bogliazzo. And the ring dance groups, prominent among the figurines, recall the role of dance in binding communities. And Sicon's complaint that women tend to get drunk, he says that serving wine to them is like irrigating beach sand. And once they've got drunk, they dance and you can't stop them. My second case is the Poulos cave on the northeast coast of Ithaca. Perhaps the best known shrine in the region, its interpretation as a hero shrine to Odysseus underpins Ithaca's special place in the archaeology of Nostoi. It's usually dated at least to the 9th century on the basis of the tripod dedications, assumed to recall Odysseus' own, although there's no epigraphic evidence of his name until the 2nd century. And this association has been further developed into an idea that Odysseus is a kind of proto-colonial figure honoured on Ithaca by those en route to the west, effectively making Poulos an interstate sanctuary and a maritime destination. Well, I don't think it's quite that. This approach downplays local agency in determining the overall shape of ritual activity and providing for it. And it does cherry-pick data from a much larger record of a single phase of a site, which continues into Roman times. It neither documents nor explains this diachronic development, and in setting aside the local and regional context, it ignores one set of questions that I think are very interesting: the constituency and interests represented, the behaviours implicating individual categories of material, and the relationship between individual offerings and collective events. Poulos stands out in the islands for its wealth and range of votives. Successive fashions for offering tripods, arms and armour, metal vessels, perfumes, oil and figurines reflect wide connections and more diverse forms of engagement than at Bogliazzo. But underlying all this is the longest history of ritual consumption in the islands, running from a 10th century rural gathering to well-documented food service in classical and Hellenistic times. The cave is in fact a rock shelter, fine to display votives and the debris of feasts, but too small for gatherings which were probably held on the neighbouring plain. The foundation of a festival during the early Iron Age, at the most northerly point regularly visible from the Acropolis of Aitos, coincides with that town's particular prominence in the region in terms of size and wealth. It likely reflects control of the entire island. A Poulos dimension is then clear in this mid-6th century inscription, which records a dedication by the Peripoloi of Athena Polias and Hera Teleia. Now, the Peripoloi themselves are rather interesting. Extrapolating from an Athenian ephebia or Hellenistic magistresses is a stretch. But there's a clear general sense of those who watch, guard, wander, or patrol. So where were they active? What might constitute boundaries or margins for Ithaca? The constituent communities of the polis, particular locations like the sanctuary, the island itself, or the sea lanes surrounding it. Overarching island identity is just one tier of expression at Poulos. Intra and inter-island dynamics flowed alongside and in tension with it. The seaside location encourages us to think of axis of larger maritime and intra-archipelago dimensions. But there are also signs of even more local interests. From the late 6th century, when settlement was well established above Poulos Bay at Stavros, commemoration of feasting was not confined to the cave. A terrace on the opposite side of the valley held a series of carefully structured late archaic and classical feasting deposits, ash and a selection of vessels, which were left exposed and visible after each event. Whatever the scale of this activity, and we have just a tiny area exposed, it must stand in some relation to the events represented in the cave. The excavator suggests that participants were local residents expressing an identity distinct from the interests in the cave itself. If so, it may be better to see this not in terms of opposition, but as an added layer of complexity internal to the island, a dialogue with the traditions commemorated in the cave, conducted through the medium of food. Now, these two cases offer just a small taste of the rich sanctuary record now emerging. Much more could be said about diachronic development. We're only just beginning to understand ritual consumption as an integral part of the food economies of Greek states, and we need to think in much greater detail about how this worked in the islands. But in the interest of time, I turn very briefly to my final topic, to objects which stake claims to connections via combinations of word, image, and context. Two examples from the ends of our period serve as an illustration. The first is one of 5 early 7th century decanters from Iatos, a local shape, effectively a huge conical inoquy, for pouring and sharing, if not wine, perhaps some kind of additive, surely in a sympotic context. The metrical text around the body, referring to a xenos, a philos, a hetairos, is all about conviviality. On decanters of this group, body and base decoration interact. I've put you on another example which shows exactly this, the tense crouched wild beast and the rearing horse, different painterly styles, different kinds of motion. Our decanter has a conical inoquy on the base, not a self-portrait, but the small angular votive form, normal for this period, found in Greek sanctuaries or in Italian graves. We're surely invited to link the vase form, the verse and the base depiction in an elaborate play on capacity and generosity, divine ritual and the human symposium, the host's treatment of a guest. This is a vessel to be tipped, turned and talked about. The inscription is the earliest example of the Achaean epicoric alphabet, painted pre-firing by the same hand as the rest of the decoration. Achaean script, perhaps more than any other, is a bricolage. In Lillian Jeffrey's words, a mixture resulting from the fusion of the scripts of Sicyon and Corinth on the eastern border with those of Elis to the west and Phocis across the Gulf. A pattern of contacts long evident in other aspects of the material record of Iatos. The potter, painter, was literate or a good copyist, and their work follows a local tradition of non-alphabetic marking used to convey information which cannot now be read directly, but which can more or less be understood in context. In short, this is quite a remarkable vessel, but it's the kind of one-off which is often overlooked in discussion of early text. My second example brings us back to epic poetry. As I noted at the start of my talk, scholarly attention long focused on finding traces of the Odyssey. Yet the ancient Ithacians themselves used Odysseus rather differently. He is asserted as Polis' hero in emblematic fashion on coinage and in the Odyssea festival, but only in classical and Hellenistic times, in the poetic context of cyclic and later epic. This context is strikingly evident in Aristotle's Constitution, which describes social practices and family identities rooted in the aftermath of Odysseus' return, with Telemachus as the central figure on Ithaca, and Odysseus off away again on his travels on some kind of adventure. There was an essential device for forging and maintaining wider connections. So Telemachus heals, he stays at home with the community. Odysseus travels off and makes the links. So I've chosen an object which fits this later context, one of a small number to use the qualities of Nostos tales as part of a political message. Nostos tales have got particular affordance. They express hope without a guaranteed outcome. Travelling heroes can come to terrible ends. They unite a desired future with a common past, and they can bridge long spatial and temporal distances. So this makes them perfect for expressing identities and relationships in the highly connected, multicultural, but very fluid world of the Ionian and Adriatic. Their very open-endedness sort of future-proofs any claims made. This late 4th or early 3rd century plaque was sent to Dodona by a Zacynthia, Agathon, son of Achepolis, perhaps on the renewal of a hereditary proxeny. It's termed a zoron rather than a dedication made in person, so it's probably a diplomatic gift. And there is nothing odd about this. The sanctuary and oracle at Dodona and Zeus Nios or Dodonaeus were often invoked in articulating relations across the northwest. Proxeny was widespread, and it's probably hereditary, at least by the mid-5th century, to judge from the Corsairian records. Nonetheless, this is a most unusual proxeny document. As Peter Fraser observes in what remains the fullest study of it, it's really odd. The opening invocation of to Zeus, Zozonis Medeon, recalls Achilles' address in Iliad 16. 3 occurrences of Genea in 10 lines play on its various meanings. Linear descent, ethnicity, or the chronicle sense of a generation. And the phallus ornament reinforces the idea of fertility and family continuity. The proxeny relationship is articulated around the prophetess Cassandra. Now, I'm not very comfortable with the idea that this refers to some local Molossian tradition, that Cassandra was the first priestess at Dodona, because the usual source for this claim is this inscription. So the argument is circular. But local tradition or biography must somehow be implicated. So alongside Dodona, we should consider Agathon's Zacynthine circle. A link with the polis of Zakynthos seems unlikely, given the enmity between Cassandra and the city's patron deity, Apollo, who is all over city coinage at this time. Trojan connections are securely attested only in late Republican times, so it's a bit of a stretch to push them back this far. For Thucydides, Zakynthos is an Achaean colony. But since the dedicator's name, Agathon, was also that of Cassandra's brother in Iliad 24, Peter Fraser makes the interesting suggestion that the connection worked at the level of family descent. In other words, a social cachet akin to that of Trojan descent in Rome. Well, we can only guess at the antiquity of a hereditary proxeny and the exact relations involved. But it's really striking to see the mythical past so far bound into future promise, raising the question of whether this relationship somehow needed a bit of extra support. Dodona's geographical reach, according to oracular records and dedications, barely touched the central Ionian islands. And Zakynthos is so far south that it could be socially marginal even for the northern islands. Zacynthine wives buried at Hellenistic Lefkas are identified by their city ethnics. And in the 3rd century Delphic Theodokia list, the city is on a Peloponnesian route which extends only to Kefalonia. So perhaps we should consider how securely founded Agathon's proxeny really was, and whether this is a case of massive special pleading and future-proofing, using every bit of armoury at his disposal. Now, surveying not only the islands but the Adriatic as a whole, it's rare to find objects or monuments that weave together allusions with quite this sophistication. Simple storytelling is more common. But they exist, and when we focus on commonalities in the way they communicate, rather than treating them as curios, they reveal a long history of thought about the languages of engagement. So it's time, I think, to wrap up. Arguing for the integral role of material culture in any regional history is pushing at an open door. We're all interdisciplinary, whatever we believe it to mean. But how far we lean in and trust the kind of material narratives I've presented here has a major impact on the extent to which regions like the Ionian archipelago find a place in the writing of Greek history. We can relegate them as peripheral and continue to build models from text-rich regions, or we can embrace them as marginal areas where complex decisions were taken, in turn exposing critical issues in the social and political development of their neighbours. Take the growth of federalism. Economic connections between the islands and large parts of northwest Greece grew tighter and more varied over time, crossing substantial geographical and political diversity, including federal boundaries, with local identities ever more strongly expressed. What decision paths within this palimpsest led to the formation of specific federal entities and the placing of their boundaries? We may argue for path dependency. Paths were not followed at the same pace or even with the same clarity of direction in different localities. When and how did they have to mesh to enable larger cooperations? And were the steps taken to achieve that then influential or vulnerable to external circumstances? And these kind of questions seem to be one way to find the glue to stick together the complementary pictures of federalism presented by the like of Funke, Beck and Macchio. The picture of the Ionian archipelago that I've given you is a slice in time. Hindsight may suggest a tipping point at which investment to develop markets and connect communities was widely beneficial. But there was no guarantee of longevity, invulnerability, or immutability. Grasping this complexity and uncertainty is an important first step towards understanding the development of Hellenistic states in the Northwest and just how much more we have still to do towards this. So thank you for your patience. I should say my most important thank you of all to all the project directors who I've worked with to put that together.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. A feast for the eyes as well as for the mind. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Perhaps I can ask you to put your hands up and wait for the microphone before asking your question. The gentleman at the back got in first, I think. And I'll...
You have identified a certain island as Ithaca. Is this the same as Homer's Ithaca? Because there's been a dispute in recent years between scholars as to the identification of Ithaca, where it was. Was it just a myth handed down in the oral tradition?
Yeah. Okay. I tend to be very persuaded by Martin West's argument about the slow movement of the Odyssey and the placing of the Odyssey in this region in about the 7th century.
I see.
The name of the island of Ithaca is remarkably consistent in its textual use, the coinage, the festivals, whatever. I don't think that shifts. What Homer is describing as the kingdom is clearly larger than one island. All right. But the actual story and the dispute comes directly out of the kind of cultural narratives I began this paper with, this engagement of people trying to research Homer in hand and find it on the ground, that caused such a wonderful and rich engagement with so many local communities who desperately wanted to believe that theirs was the real Ithaca. And it's sort of, I won't say it's spun out of control a little bit, but it's gone in very interesting argument. I mean, the argument is really a modern story, not an ancient one.
Yes.
There's a very, very witty book written by a sea captain friend of mine called Homer's Ithaca on Kefalonia, Fact and Fantasy in the History of an Idea. And it looks at 100 years of where various people have tried to put it and the political and social interests around that. It's wonderful.
Thank you. There's someone at the front. Yeah.
Hello, yes, sir.
No, it's to record.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Yes, very interested in the bronze plaque. 3 points. I've been to Dodona, so I know that shows it's in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens now. Was it found in Dodona? And 2 other points. I know it has lug holes in it. Was it sort of pinned to a herm, because a lot of herms have phalloi on them? And the third point is it's context with what you're saying. It's linked mainly to Ithaca, is that right?
No, it's linked to Zakynthos.
Sorry,
okay. Yes, it's from the Kalapanos excavations, which is how it landed up, the very early excavations in the sanctuary. He refers to it, the excavation context is clear. All his bronze material went up to the National Museum. The holes, a lot of these kind of bronze plaques do have holes. A lot of our assumptions is that they're nailed somehow either to wooden posts or to something that is movable. I don't think we can actually specifically tie it to a herm-like function. Various sort of forms of fertility symbolism attached in the 3rd and 2nd century is not that unusual. This is a little bit large and prominent, and its juxtaposition with the text is interesting. But I don't think it's particularly...
Thank you. It's very helpful, because I went to Don and I also went to Ionina, where a lot of the finds are there, but they're from later excavations.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we've had 140 years of excavation at that site.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Can I ask? Has the coastline changed very much since ancient times?
Yeah. On the Acarnanian coast, really substantially. The coast that you see now and those embayments is basically 19th century land reclamation. Those are very much really quite substantial bays, marshlands, the works. In the islands, the main factors that are causing change within the period that we are talking about, not far back, is a very, very high seismic activity. This is one of the most active regions of Greece. And in fact, if you swim around the edge of Poulos Cave, you can see the notches, the coastline notches. A friend of mine in Kalamata is running a very interesting archaeological project, actually focused on precisely this issue of the metre on either side of the coast, just to see what we can see archaeologically and what may have been submerged. So yes, there is the basic shape is there. In terms of large areas of submerged material, no, we're not missing that in the islands. In the Anaconania, yes, we are, substantially. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting, Kathy, and thank you so much for that. I was wondering, looking at the way your settlements, your little polis or whatever they are arranged round islands, do you have any sense at this stage of how they're using the middle? Because I noticed that as in many other parts of Greece and indeed southern Italy, one has this phenomenon of settlements either not on the either on the coast or just above, but then this kind of wonderful kind of upland hinterland, which clearly they're all sharing in some way or they're all engaging with. Have you got any sense yet of how they might be doing that?
I think the sense is clearest in southern Kefalonia, where quite a lot of work has been done on the mountain, on Enos, on the movement of resources, particularly timber resources. Yeah, it's pretty clear in Lefkada. I mean, Lefkada has essentially oak coverage, which makes it pretty hard to survey and look at. Fundamentally, we've got to run LiDAR over it at some point to really look closely. I think a lot of the products for which the island has some kind of reputation in antiquity, the resins, the waxes, do relate to upland resources of some kind.
You've got no sense of the extent to which people are... but you've got no sense yet to the extent to which people are, as it were, archaeologically visibly exploiting any of this.
Only in the sense of what's around the tower complexes. The towers are clearly relating to that area that is not within close reach of the city. On Ithaca, I mentioned very briefly this work of a DPhil students of mine using the historical RAF imagery. The wonder of that is the flight was in 1948, so it's directly before a massive earthquake that really changed quite a bit of topography. And it's when the island was as clean as possible because every inch was being cultivated in World War II. So it's quite extraordinary imagery. He is beginning to show a number of structures that look really curious on the mountain slopes on Ithaca. In fact, one of the things we've got to do this summer is walk up together and just see if we can ground truth any of these things. They don't fit what we know of the later medieval record. That's it's a classic problem. It depends what you're looking for. But the other issue, sorry not to give a very long answer, but one of the real problems that we've got in looking at the kind of material that gets into upland sites is dating it, if you don't have fine pottery. And I should mention colleagues of mine who are working in the Kythera survey, who for a very long time have been working really tightly on the ceramic recipes, the petrography of pots period by period, to the point that you can actually almost date stuff by virtue of its fabric. And lo and behold, we found stuff in the mountains behind the Poulos of Kythera this summer that where the profiles look a bit weird and the the fabric is directly on a cross point, it's got to be early Iron Age. That is the only way you're going to be able to date that kind of stuff. So we're a long way to go in the kind of material science that enables us to work on this material. Think about it. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's very interesting. I suppose I've got one last question, really, is that do you think there's potential for underwater archaeology to answer some of the questions in this particular region?
Absolutely. Underwater archaeology is a slightly delicate point in Greece, so I think this answer may have to be cut from anything that goes online. There has been a very substantial Greco-Norwegian echo-sonar survey round the islands, including through the straits, north and south part, 4 wrecks have been very clearly identified and referred to in press, and I've seen the material. Of course, echo sounding needs a lot of follow-up work to sort out what the anomalies actually are. The project was stopped for political reasons, which I can't go into.
Right.
It's very delicate, it's very sensitive. Yes, I would love to see a load more underwater work done in those areas, particularly wreck work. But
well, thank you very much. We'd be better, a great ox had better stand on our tongues on that one then. Sorry, we can't resist getting a bit of text in, a bit more text in. Had some. But above all, I want to thank you very much indeed for a most wonderful paper. It really was terrific. It's opened up a whole new world for me, and I'm sure for everyone else here. Astounding to think of all this activity going on, and most interesting. Thank you so much. I think we should thank Professor Morgan in the usual way and have a cup of tea.